I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Richard Goldberg, Senior Advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Richard, thanks so much for coming back on.
Of course.
You and I talk every couple of weeks about where we are in the Israel-Hamas war. As we sit here right now, we're about 11 months in, and we had a really heartbreaking update over the past week. 6 hostages were killed in Gaza, including an American citizen, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. This moment has been described to me as a real turning point. Can you talk about the moment we're in right now?
Yeah, I think it's important to have two different parallel tracks that unfortunately intersect throughout this. We've talked about, and that, of course, is the military track against Hamas itself and the rest of the Iran terror axis. And sort of what does the progress there look like 11 months in? And then, of course, there is the hostages and the devastating news that 6 were executed by Hamas, even though the Israelis and the Americans thought that they were close to having a deal with Hamas. And in fact, Hamas, we've now learned, pulled away from the table during negotiations last week, moved goalposts, and then executed 6 hostages. First, look at the military side and the counterterrorism side. I think important to realize that Hamas is under an enormous amount of pressure here. This is not the same organization that it was 11 months ago. Certainly, they've had an enormous number of fighters killed, so the terrorists on the ground, at least half potentially their fighting force wiped out. You have seen their major leaders taken out. Obviously, we know about Ismail Haniyeh, who usually had lived in Doha, Qatar, while he was in Tehran, being killed, most likely in an Israeli action. But of course, others in Gaza as well. Mohammed Daif, the key lieutenant, the number 2 to Yahya Sinwar, who is still at large. We've seen other Hamas leaders in Lebanon taken out with direct strikes. We've also seen key leaders of Hezbollah taken out. The chief of staff, Fuad Shukr, also described as the Qasem Soleimani of Hezbollah, that same night that we saw Haniyeh taken out. A lot of the senior leaders of the special forces of Hezbollah taken out as well in southern Lebanon. But if you go back to Hamas there, Hamas increasingly looks like an organization on its last legs. It's running out of territory, it's running out of tunnels, it's running out of leaders and commanders and battalions and people who can actually create a fighting force with some semblance of command and control. And Israel continuing to keep the military pressure on what remains in Gaza, while now picking up the pressure on what exists in the West Bank, another major area really not reported on for 11 months, but where the IDF has been conducting almost daily raids against Hamas Islamic Jihad cells, now really increasing their operations there in the last few days with intelligence that they were going to face a wave of suicide bombings and car bombings of what Iran was planning out there. I think you put that picture together, plus the Israelis taking the Philadelphia corridor, that's that key area that separates Gaza from Egypt, discovering hundreds of tunnels underneath that border that Hamas had used to resupply weapons, obviously not just before October 7th, but ever since October 7th, until the Israelis went into Rafah, that southernmost city, and took the border. And so if you're Yahya Sinwar right now, the hostages are it. That's your leverage. That was always your leverage from the beginning, your ace in the hole, should you be up against the wall in your 11th hour. And I think that 11th hour is closely arriving. And it could be either why you are seeing desperate, horrific, evil moves like executing hostages from Sinwar, because maybe he knows and understands that if the pressure continues, if Israel continues to move in towards where he is hiding, that they will find some other hostages, hopefully alive. Obviously, one was found alive before this horrible tragedy, before this horrible nightmare. And that they might, in fact, collapse and find Sinwar himself and take him out. So he is now probably thinking about his last plays. Obviously, it's a wider network, what Hezbollah is doing in the north, what the Houthis do in Yemen, what Iran does out of Tehran, running this entire playbook for their access. It's all pieces that we can't move apart. But you're right. At the same time, you have the devastating emotional impact, the psychological impact, the human impact of what is happening to hostages who have been taken for 11 months almost, who have not come home, who are being executed in captivity, what the anguish is to the family members who are watching this happen, who just want their loved ones home, who don't know who to talk to, don't know who to scream at, so they go to the streets and scream at their own government to say, please help us, please do more. And of course, Hamas wants to see that. That's why they're doing it. They want pressure on Israel internally and externally as part of their last hurrah to try to save themselves, their Hail Mary in their 11th hour.